General Motors Company, commonly known as GM, is an American multinational corporation headquartered in Detroit, Michigan, that designs, manufactures, markets and distributes vehicles and vehicle parts and sells financial services. General Motors produces vehicles in 37 countries under 13 brands: Alfion, Chevrolet, Buick, GMC, Cadillac, Holden, HSV, Opel, Vauxhall, Wuling, Baojun, Jifang, Daewoo. General Motors holds a 20% stake in IMM, and a 77% stake in GM Korea. It also has a number of joint ventures, including Shanghai GM, SAIC GM Wuling and FAW GM in China, GM Avtovaz in Russia, Gandhara Industries in Pakistan, GM Uzbekistan, General Motors India, General Motors Egypt, and Isuzu Truck South Africa. General Motors employs 212,000 people and does business in more than 120 countries. General Motors is divided into 5 business segments: GM North America, Opel Group, GM International Operations, GM South America, and GM Financial. As part of its 2009 bankruptcy restructuring, the current company, General Motors Company LLC, was founded in 2009. After the bankruptcy of the General Motors Corporation, the new company purchased the majority of the assets of old GM, including the name of General Motors. Business units. General Motors produces vehicles in 37 countries under 13 brands: Alfion, Chevrolet, Buick, GMC, Cadillac, Holden, HSV, Opel, Vauxhall, Wuling, Baojun, Jifang, Daewoo. General Motors holds a 20% stake in IMM, and a 77% stake in GM Korea. It also has a number of joint ventures, including Shanghai GM, SAIC GM Wuling and FAW GM in China, GM Avtovaz in Russia, Gandhara Industries in Pakistan, GM Uzbekistan, General Motors India, General Motors Egypt, and Isuzu Truck South Africa. General Motors employs 212,000 people and does business in more than 120 countries. General Motors is divided into 5 business segments: GM North America, Opel Group, GM International Operations, GM South America, and GM Financial. General Motors led global vehicle sales for 77 consecutive years from 1931 through 2007, longer than any other automaker, and is currently among the world's largest automakers by vehicle unit sales. General Motors acts in most countries outside the U.S. via wholly owned subsidiaries, but operates in China through 10 joint ventures. GM's OnStar subsidiary provides vehicle safety, security and information services. In 2009, General Motors shared several brands, closing Saturn, Pontiac, and Hummer, and emerged from a government-backed Chapter 11 reorganization. In 2010, the reorganized GM made an initial public offering that was one of the world's top 5 largest IPOs to date and returned to profitability later that year. History. The company was founded on September 16, 1908, in Flint, Michigan, as a holding company for McLaughlin Car Company of Canada Limited and Buick, then controlled by William C. Durant. At the beginning of the 20th century there were fewer than 8,000 automobiles in America, and Durant had become a leading manufacturer of horse-drawn vehicles in Flint before making his foray into the automotive industry. GM's co-founder was Charles Stewart Mott, whose carriage company was merged into Buick prior to GM's creation. Over the years Mott became the largest single stockholder in GM and spent his life with his Mott Foundation, which has benefited the city of Flint, his adopted home. GM acquired Oldsmobile later that year. In 1909, Durant brought in Cadillac, Elmore, Oakland and several others. Also in 1909, GM acquired the Reliance Motor Truck Company of Owasso, Michigan, and the Rapid Motor Vehicle Company of Pontiac, Michigan, the predecessors of GMC Truck. Durant lost control of GM in 1910 along with R.S. McLaughlin to a banker's trust, because of the large amount of debt taken on in its acquisitions coupled with a collapse in new vehicle sales. The next year, Durant started the Chevrolet Motor Car Company in 1911 in the U.S., in Canada in 1915, and through this he secretly purchased a controlling interest in GM. Durant took back control of the company after one of the most dramatic proxy wars in American business history. Durant then reorganized General Motors Company into General Motors Corporation in 1916, merging Chevrolet with GM and merging General Motors of Canada Limited as an ally in 1918. Shortly after, he again lost control, this time for good, after the new vehicle market collapsed. Alfred P. Sloan was picked to take charge of the corporation and led it to its post-war global dominance when the 7 manufacturing facilities operated by Chevrolet before GM acquired the company began to contribute to GM operations. These facilities were added to the individual factories that were exclusive to Cadillac, Buick, Oldsmobile, Oakland, and other companies acquired by GM. This unprecedented growth of GM would last into the early 1980s when it employed 349,000 workers and operated 150 assembly plants. General Motors led global sales for 77 consecutive years from 1931 through 2007, longer than any other automaker. In 2008, 2009 and 2010, GM has ranked as the second largest global automaker by sales. The company regained its position as the world's largest automaker, by vehicle unit sales, in 2011. General Motors acts in most countries outside the U.S. via wholly owned subsidiaries, but operates in China through 10 joint ventures. GM's OnStar subsidiary provides vehicle safety, security and information services. In 2009, General Motors shared several brands, closing Saturn, Pontiac, and Hummer, and emerged from a government-backed Chapter 11 reorganization. In 2010, the reorganized GM made an initial public offering that was one of the world's top 5 largest IPOs to date and returned to profitability later that year. As of 2011, General Motors produces vehicles in 37 countries under 13 brands: Alfion, Chevrolet, Buick, GMC, Cadillac, Holden, HSV, Opel, Vauxhall, Wuling, Baojun, Jifang, Daewoo. General Motors holds a 20% stake in IMM, and a 77% stake in GM Korea. It also has a number of joint ventures, including Shanghai GM, SAIC GM Wuling and FAW GM in China, GM Avtovaz in Russia, Gandhara Industries in Pakistan, GM Uzbekistan, General Motors India, General Motors Egypt, and Isuzu Truck South Africa. General Motors employs 212,000 people and does business in more than 120 countries. General Motors is divided into 5 business segments: GM North America, Opel Group, GM International Operations, GM South America, and GM Financial. Chapter 11 bankruptcy. On July 10, 2009, General Motors emerged from government-backed Chapter 11 reorganization after an initial filing on June 8, 2009. Through the Troubled Asset Relief Program, the U.S. Treasury invested $49.5 billion in General Motors and recovered $39 billion when it sold its shares on December 9, 2013, resulting in a loss of $10.3 billion. The Treasury invested an additional $17.2 billion into GM's former financing company, GMAC. The shares in Ally were sold on December 18, 2014 for $19.6 billion, netting $2.4 billion. A study by the Center for Automotive Research found that the GM bailout saved 1.2 million jobs and preserved $34.9 billion in tax revenue. In the reorganization, Hummer, Pontiac and Saturn were closed. After initially moving to shut down the Swedish brand Saab, GM eventually sold it to Dutch automaker Spyker. Corporate governance. Based on global sales, General Motors is routinely among the world's largest automakers. Headquartered at the Renaissance Center in Detroit, GM employs approximately 202,000 people around the world. In 2009, General Motors sold 6.5 million cars and trucks globally. In 2010, it sold 8.4 million. As of 2015, update. Theodore Salzer is the non-executive chairman of the board of directors. Mary Barra is the chief executive officer and Daniel Ammon is the president. The head of design, Edward T. Welburn, was the first African American to lead a global automotive design organization, and as of 2014, update, the highest-ranking African American in the U.S. motor industry. As a part of the company's advertising, Ed Whitaker announced the company's 60-day money-back guarantee and repayment of $6.7 billion loan from government ahead of schedule. On December 12, 2013, GM announced that Mary Barra, 51, Executive Vice President, Global Products Development, Purchasing and Supply Chain, was elected by the board of directors to become the next CEO of the company, succeeding Dan Akerson on January 15, 2014. Barra also joined the GM board. From June 2009 to March 2011, the company had 3 chief executive officers and 3 chief financial officers. Financial results. The company has reported annual profits since 2010. It can carry forward previous losses to reduce tax liability on future earnings. It earned $4.7 billion in 2010. The Wall Street Journal estimated the tax break, including credits for costs related to pensions and other expenses, can be worth as much as $45 billion over the next 20 years. In 2010, General Motors ranked second on the list with 8.5 million units produced globally. In 2011, GM returned to the first place with 9.025 million units sold worldwide, corresponding to 11.9% market share of the global motor vehicle industry. The top 2 markets in 2011 were China, with 2,547,203 units, and the United States, with 2,503,820 vehicles sold. The Chevrolet brand was the main contributor to GM performance, with 4.76 million vehicles sold around the world in 2011, a global sales record. In May 2013, during a commencement speech, CEO Dan Akerson suggested that GM was on the cusp of rejoining the S&P 500 index. GM was removed from the index as it approached bankruptcy in 2009. On April 24, 2014, CNN Money reported that GM profits fell to $108 million for the first 3 months of 2014. GM now estimates the cost of their 2014 recall due to faulty ignition switches, which have been linked to at least 13 deaths, at $1.3 billion. Shares of GM were down 16% for the year before the new announcement of GM's lower profits. World presence. North America. General Motors Canada is reported to be in the Superior Court of Ontario, Canada, as a privately owned Canadian company with the corporation as indirect parent. The employees are not all Canadian, as salary personnel are from the U.S., and work for the corporation. GM products focus primarily on its 4 core divisions: Chevrolet, Cadillac, Buick, and GMC. The GM restructuring has resulted in a lower break-even point for annual sales and renewed profits. In the mid-2005, GM announced that its corporate chrome power emblem, Mark of Excellence, would begin appearing on all recently introduced and all-new 2006 model vehicles produced and sold in North America. However, in 2009 the new GM reversed this, saying that emphasis on its 4 core divisions would downplay the GM logo. GM typically reports as among the largest automakers in the United States. In May 2012, GM recorded an 18.4% market share in the U.S. South America. In 2008, the third largest individual country by sales was Brazil, with some 550,000 GM vehicles sold. In that year, the other South American countries Argentina, Colombia, and Venezuela sold another 300,000 GM vehicles, suggesting that the total GM sales in South America in that year were at a similar level to sales in China. Europe. Opel is the main GM brand name in Europe except in the United Kingdom, where Opel's British subsidiary, Vauxhall, still uses its own Vauxhall brand name. The Chevrolet brand was reintroduced in Europe in 2005, selling mostly South Korean-made small cars. In 2012, PSA, Peugeot, Citroën and General Motors formed an alliance, which involved General Motors acquiring 7% of PSA Group. On December 13, 2013, GM announced it had divested itself from the 7%, generating gross proceeds of €0.25 billion. Also in December 2013, GM announced it would drop the Chevrolet brand in Europe by Q4 2015. To focus on Opel, Vauxhall, Chevrolets will continue to be sold in Russia and the Commonwealth of Independent States. GM lost approximately $18 billion over the past 12 years in Europe. Asia. The company manufactures most of its China market vehicles locally. Shanghai GM, a joint venture with the Chinese company SAIC Motor, was created on March 25, 1997. The Shanghai GM plant was officially opened on December 15, 1998, when the first Chinese-built Buick came off the assembly line. The SAIC GM Wuling automobile joint venture is also successfully selling microvans under the Wuling brand. Much of General Motors' recent growth has been in the People's Republic of China, where its sales rose 66.9% in 2009, selling 1,830,000 vehicles and accounting for 13.4% of the market. Buick is strong in China, being led by the Buick Enclave subcompact. The last emperor of China owned a Buick. The Cadillac brand was introduced in China in 2004, starting with exports to China. GM pushed the marketing of the Chevrolet brand in China in 2005 as well, transferring Buick sale to that brand. In August 2009, the joint venture of FAW GM Light Duty Commercial Vehicle Co. Limited was formed that mainly produces Jifang light-duty trucks. General Motors vehicle sales in China rose 28.8% to a record 2,351,610 units in 2010. GM set up an auto research center as part of a $250 million United States corporate campus in Shanghai to develop gasoline hybrid cars, electric vehicles and alternative fuels, engines and new technologies. The company plans to double its sales from 2010 to about 5 million units in China by 2015. SAIC GM Wuling established the low-cost Baojun brand to better compete with domestic rivals, Chery, Geely and BYD for first-time buyers of cars priced around $10,000 United States dollars. It is estimated that such market in China is about 5 million vehicles a year, larger than the auto market in France and Britain combined. However, some are worried that local brands like Baojun could eventually become threats to their parent brands if they compete more against established models over time. Shanghai GM Wuling sold 1.23 million vehicles in 2010, mainly commercial vans and trucks, of which about 700,000 units were a van called Sunshine. GM maintains a dealership presence in Japan, called GM Chevrolet Shop, previously known as GM Auto World Shop. Current GM Japan dealerships were either former Saturn dealerships or Isuzu dealership locations. GM products are also currently sold by the company Yavno Co., Limited. Since 1915. In August 2011, GM announced plans to reactivate its plant that previously produced rebadged Chevrolet Blazer as Opel as well as Brazilian Blazer, and also build a new plant in Bekasi, West Java, Indonesia, which would produce 40,000 passenger cars per year for the Southeast Asian market. It is the third plant in Southeast Asia, after the Rayong plant, Thailand, and the Hanoi plant, Vietnam. In October 2011, the South Korea Free Trade Agreement opened up the South Korean auto market to American-made cars. GM owns 77.0% of its joint venture in South Korea, GM Korea. On March 11, 2013, GM opened a new 190,300 square foot manufacturing plant in Bekasi, Indonesia. In February 2015, GM announced they will close the Bekasi plant by the end of June and stop production of the Sonic in Thailand by mid-year. Africa. GM has a long history in Egypt, which began in the 1920s with the assembly of cars and light pickup trucks for the local market. In the mid of the 1950s, GM withdrew from the Egyptian market. Some year later, the Gabor brothers began to assemble Cadillac, Chevrolet, and Buick models up to the 1990s. Since 1983, GM and Al Mansour Automotive Company have owned General Motors Egypt, which is currently the only manufacturer of traditional GM-branded vehicles in Egypt. The Speranza Motors is a big company which started in the 1990s with the SKD assembling of Daewoo cars. Today the main products of Speranza are from the Chinese Chery concern. Following the passage of the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in 1986, GM was forced to divest from South Africa, and GMSA became the independent Delta Motor Corporation. GM purchased a 49% stake in Delta in 1997 following the end of apartheid, and acquired the remaining 51% in 2004, reverting the company to its original name. The company began operating in South Africa in 1913 through its wholly owned subsidiary, General Motors South Africa. By 2014 it was targeting the production of 50,000 cars a year but was being hampered by national labor unrest, strikes and protests. Another manufacturing base of the GM for the African markets is the Industries Mécaniques Maghrébines headquartered in Kairouan, Tunisia, which assembles Isuzu and Mazda models for the Maghreb region. General Motors East Africa, located in Nairobi, Kenya, assembles a wide range of Isuzu trucks and buses, including the popular Isuzu N-Series versatile light commercial vehicle, TF Series pickups and Isuzu bus chassis. Formed in 1975, GMEA's facility is the largest assembler of commercial vehicles in the region, exporting to East and Central African countries including Uganda, Tanzania, Malawi, Rwanda and Burundi. In addition to assembly, GMEA also markets the Chevrolet products Spark and Optra. In the 1920s, Miller Brothers Nigeria was founded as an importer of commercial vehicles of the Bedford brand into the country. In 1949, the company opened its own assembly plant and operated under the name Nigeria Motors. In 1965 the plant and its distribution network was split into different companies and renamed as Federated Motors Industries. In 1991 the company was taken in by a joint venture between General Motors and UACN of Nigeria, Oceania in Australia and New Zealand. GM has been represented by the Holden brand since 1948, GM having acquired the company in 1931. In 2012, GM Opel cars began to be imported into Australia as a niche mark under their own brand name. However, as of August 2013, GM has made the decision to remove the Opel brand from Australia, noting poor adoption and sales. In the 1980s and 1990s, General Motors New Zealand sold Opel-badged cars, which were later rebadged as Holdens in 1994. On December 10, 2013, GM announced that Holden would cease engine and vehicle manufacturing operations in Australia by the end of 2017. Beyond 2017, Holden's Australian presence will consist of a national sales company, a parts distribution centre and a global design studio.